Today, we're decoding a massive global puzzle. We're looking at how a seemingly ordinary natural resource, specifically a type of rock found in North Africa, literally dictates global food survival and triggers some intense international tensions. Honestly, when you hear the whole story, it sounds like a Hollywood script. We're talking desolate desert warfare, heavily guarded secret monopolies, billion-dollar military buildups, and ultimately, the very food on your plates. But this isn't a movie. It's very real, and it affects every single one of us. So let's just get right into it. Think about your last trip to the grocery store. Picture the aisles packed with fresh produce, the towering displays of bread, the meat counters, every single item in that store, and the survival of the billions of people who rely on those stores traces back to one really fundamental question. How could a localized geological element possibly be the linchpin for global agricultural stability, and by extension, our entire economic health? It's fascinating and honestly a little terrifying when you step back and realize just how profoundly fragile our modern systems truly are. Part 1. The Global Resource Mystery. So what are we talking about here? Phosphates. And these aren't just everyday rocks you'd find scattered on the ground. They are highly specific, absolutely essential minerals that quite literally feed the planet. To really grasp the stakes here, we have to look at the basic biology of how things grow. Phosphorus is a fundamental building block of life. It forms the structural framework of DNA and RNA, but even more crucially for agriculture, it's the P in ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is the molecule that provides energy to drive almost every process in living cells. Without phosphorus, plants just can't undergo photosynthesis. They can't convert sunlight into energy. Their roots fail, they stop growing, and they die. And here's the kicker. There is no synthetic substitute for it in a laboratory. It absolutely must be mined from the earth. Without these raw materials, acting as the foundation for global fertilizers, modern agriculture would entirely stall, and food scarcity would become an immediate, devastating reality for billions of people. Part 2. Driving the world's agriculture. Now, modern agricultural innovations, like highly controlled vertical farming, are celebrated for their incredible efficiency. By stacking crops in climate-controlled indoor environments, using targeted LED lighting, and running operations year-round regardless of the weather outside, these high-tech systems can be up to 500 times more efficient than traditional outdoor farming. That's a massive leap forward for maximizing our food output on a shrinking planet. But there's a massive catch here. These advanced farms don't use soil. They utilize hydroponic and aeroponic systems, meaning the roots of the plants are suspended in air or water, relying 100% on heavily concentrated liquid nutrient solutions to survive. And the primary ingredient in those life-giving solutions? Pure mined phosphates. So ironically, as our agricultural technology becomes more advanced and strips away the natural soil, we're becoming fundamentally more dependent on this specific raw material, not less. And this brings us to a terrifying bottleneck. Morocco holds an overwhelming, dominant global monopoly on these vital phosphate reserves compared to the rest of the entire planet combined. They control roughly 70 to 75% of all known phosphate rock on Earth. To put that scale into perspective for a second, think about the global oil market. The entire OPEC cartel, representing over a dozen major oil-producing nations combined, controls about 80% of the world's proven oil reserves. Saudi Arabia alone only holds about 15%. Meanwhile, Morocco holds 75% of the world's phosphates all by itself. Oil fuels our cars and industries, sure, but phosphates fuel human bodies. When one single nation controls the absolute bedrock of the global food supply to that degree, they hold an unprecedented, almost unimaginable amount of geopolitical leverage. Part 3. Securing the Western Sahara. Morocco finally conquered Western Sahara, and nobody noticed. This is the reality of a quiet, yet massive geopolitical maneuver. You see, a vast majority of these essential phosphate reserves aren't actually located within Morocco's internationally recognized historical borders. They're located further south, in the disputed territory of the Western Sahara. So securing this monopoly meant Morocco had to expand its territory into a harsh, heavily contested desert landscape. And what's truly remarkable here is how this massive shift, the effective takeover of the most important mining region on Earth, happened almost entirely under the radar of the general public. While the world was distracted by the Cold War, oil crises, and conflicts in the Middle East, a profound terrestrial conquest was quietly taking place right there in North Africa. We can actually track the phases of this strategic maneuver over the decades. First came the mapping of the resource and the stark realization of the world's vital, unavoidable dependence on it. Then, moving into the late 20th century, we saw the strategic territorial maneuvers begin. Following the withdrawal of Spanish colonial forces in the 1970s, Morocco orchestrated what's known as the Green March, moving hundreds of thousands of civilians and military forces into the Western Sahara to claim the land. To protect the vital phosphate mines and the massive conveyor belts that transport the rock to the coast, Morocco constructed the berm. This is a heavily fortified 1,700-mile-long sand wall peppered with millions of landmines and guarded by military outposts. Finally, in the present day, we see the quiet, total consolidation of this incredibly mineral-rich, disputed region. Despite decades of UN resolutions calling for referendums, the economic leverage provided by the phosphates is simply too immense, effectively silencing any massive global outcry. Part 4. Rising tensions with Algeria. But of course, a move this massive doesn't just happen in a vacuum. Regional dynamics in North Africa are shifting rapidly, and the situation is heavily deteriorating. Algeria, Morocco's massive neighbor to the east, borders the Western Sahara and has historically supported the Polisario Front, which is the indigenous Sahrawi movement fighting for the independence of the Western Sahara. Algeria views Morocco's expansion not just as an illegal occupation, but as a direct existential threat to its own national security. And they aren't just sitting back. Flush with vast wealth from its own oil and gas exports, Algeria has been actively pouring billions into modernizing its military, holding massive live-fire drills near the border, and preparing serious political and military responses. The sheer stakes over who controls these rocks have literally elevated the region to the brink of open war. We are basically watching a classic unstoppable force versus immovable object scenario play out in real time. On one side of the chessboard, Morocco is aggressively securing immense global diplomatic and economic leverage. They have the ultimate shield, right? The world literally cannot afford to sanction them or intervene forcefully because sanctioning Morocco means cutting off the global fertilizer supply. On the exact opposite side, Algeria is mobilizing a formidable, highly modernized military to counter this massive shift in regional power, absolutely refusing to allow a Moroccan hegemony to take root on its borders. It's a textbook geopolitical powder keg, heavily armed, and just waiting for a spark. Part 5. The next economic domino. So, how does a localized conflict threaten everyone watching this explainer? Well, because these rocks are the absolute foundation of global agriculture, any fallout from this regional tension would be catastrophic in a way we just haven't experienced in modern history. The next economic crash will be completely different than before. When we think of economic disasters, we usually think of the 2008 housing bubble or the dot-com crash of the early 2000s, right? Those crises destroyed paper wealth, retirement accounts, and stock valuations. But a crash rooted in a phosphate supply chain disruption destroys the basic caloric baseline of humanity. If the phosphate exports from the Western Sahara stop due to a regional war, global crop yields could plummet by up to 50% in a single season. The price of basic staples like wheat, corn, and rice would quadruple overnight. We aren't just talking about inflation anymore. We're talking about widespread starvation, panic, and societal collapse. The dominoes are all lined up, and the momentum is entirely interconnected. It starts with a simple biological reality. Plants need phosphorus to live, meaning all human agriculture relies heavily on these specific deposits. As we attempt to feed a growing population with high-efficiency farming, our demand for these refined minerals absolutely skyrockets. To meet and control that demand, Morocco conquered the Western Sahara, securing a global monopoly behind heavily fortified desert walls. That expansion triggered escalating military tensions with a heavily armed Algeria. And if that tension snaps into full-scale conflict, the supply chain freezes, bringing with it the incredibly high risk of an unprecedented global economic crash that will hit every single dinner table on Earth. So I'll leave you with this. When our entire global food supply, our high-tech agricultural innovations, and the very survival of our modern economies hinge entirely on a single rock and the shifting, highly disputed borders of the Sahara Desert, just how fragile is our future? Are we truly prepared for what happens next? Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the world around you, and I'll see you next time.